Greetings, family. Welcome to African Esquire TV. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie. Today, I'm going to be showing a very special video that I hope will bring to light to many of you some of the difficulties that the country of Cuba faces as a result of the United States' continuance of a blockade against a country for absolutely no reason other than to flex its imperialist muscles as they have done to many countries who have asserted their sovereignty. So, this is obviously in light of what has come out yesterday that there were protests inside of Cuba because some people are complaining about some of the conditions that the country has dealt with. They have complained about a lack of vaccines, complaining about economic difficulties, all things obviously that are easily attributable to the blockade. Why aren't those people out protesting the blockade? Well, that's when you know that they're out for reasons other than liberation. Many times it's important to understand that some people have either bought into the imperialist propaganda that what they should aspire to is what happens in countries like the United States or Europe, because that's a better livelihood for people. Of course, if you are inside of the United States, you probably know that that's not true. You probably know that the homeless people inside of the country, the people that don't have access to health care, the people who are economically shut out, many times African people, that those people are not living some type of ideal world, some type of ideal existence. But unfortunately, as we said, propaganda will have you thinking that something's wrong with what you have and that you should want what the West has to offer. And that's something that they do very effectively. They do it through Hollywood, they do it through now more and more social media. And unfortunately, particularly for some young people who don't understand what uh, what sovereignty necessitates, they will buy into that propaganda. But then also, of course, there are people who know better, but they have an interest inside of continuing the capitalist exploitation of the masses of people. You also have those people who are agitating, those people who are actively assisting the spreading of propaganda because they want to topple what is a socialist country. They want to see capitalism reinstated inside of the Cuban country. You have to understand that the West has an active agenda to ensure that any type of country that is a successful socialist country fails. And they've tried that repeatedly with Cuba. By the grace of God, these people have still been able to maintain their revolution. But understand, many people have fallen by now because at the end of the day, these people have an active goal of delegitimizing something that has benefited so many people. So I just want people to have that in mind in line with the protest, and I think this video will also shine light for many of you who might have questions about what's going on in Cuba, what do the people have access to, and how does the blockade affect them. I think this video will also help there. Please keep in mind though that propaganda is propaganda. Think about the ways that the media has just been so detrimental to many of us, convincing some of us to act against ourselves, convincing some of us to support our enemies. I've been guilty of that in the past. I've been thinking that I'm on the right side, and then I find out that, oh, these people who have been demonized were actually people who would fall in line with me as far as my interests. That's what the media does. What the media will do is let's say you have a situation where 90% of the people are living miserably. 90% of the people are absolutely devastated by the economic situation that they're presented with. But 10% of the people love it. And let's say of that 10%, 5% love it even more because they benefit from the system. Well, you know what the media will do? The media will not show what the 90% are feeling. The media will try to avoid what the mighty 90% have to say. And they will focus in on what that 10% has to say, and they'll really focus in on what that 5% has to say because they want to ensure to you that you are living in the best possible situation that you can live in, which is capitalism. Now, if you look at the opposite, if you look at a country like Cuba, where education is free, healthcare is free. They have the highest literacy rate. And you compare them to a country like the United States, where many people are living in poverty. Many people don't have access to education. Many people don't have access to healthcare. And of those who do have access to healthcare, it's oftentimes subpar healthcare. If you compare the day to day lives of those who are at the bottom, the masses of people in Cuba to the United States, you might say, you know what? I would rather be someone who is disenfranchised, so to speak, in Cuba than someone who's disenfranchised in the United States, because at least then I'm not living on the streets. At least then I have access to healthcare. At least then I have access to education. But the way that the media will work is that despite the fact that, let's say, 90% of the people are doing better in one country than they are in the other country, they will have you instead focusing in on that 10% who want to complain and say that, oh, this doesn't look like what that society looks like. Or they'll say, we want things that are like freedom of press and freedom of speech, things that the Western media thrives off of whenever it's in their interest. Yet, whenever you have a situation like happened in Israel, whenever you had the Associated Press and Al Jazeera being bombed, all of a sudden, freedom of speech is not something that's important. They'll have you focusing in on that 10% people who will tell you about their hard life they've had under the socialist country, and that becomes the narrative. So I hope that I didn't take up too much time. I just wanted you to understand a little bit of how the propaganda machine works and why we have to instead put out messages of truth and show the actual reality. What are people on the ground saying? What are the people on the ground experiencing? And don't allow MSNBC, NBC, CNN, BBC, ABC, don't let any of these C's determine what you're going to see as being what is in the best interest of the people. Allow the conditions of the people to be the thing that's informing you. There's no reason why people who are poor should be living this existence of misery that many do inside of a country like the United States. And there's no reason when those poor people assert their rights and take control of their country, there's no reason they should be penalized because of the need of the United States to delegitimize socialism. So with that, I want to show you this press conference. This is something that happened last week. It was a very informative press conference, and you'll understand how how Cuba has been trying to get their vaccines out there for distribution. However, of course, the imperialist United States has done everything they could to block that for what I believe is a real need to disprove the success of that revolution. So with that, I hope you enjoy this video.
Go ahead.
All right. Good morning, all. My name is Gail Walker, and I want to welcome all members of the media as well as members of the community to this press conference to address the recent vote at the the United Nations General Assembly in opposition to the U.S. government's embargo of Cuba and Cuba's successful COVID-19 vaccine campaign. I will open up the conference with a brief statement. We will then hear from Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell, the former General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. Reverend Campbell will introduce Ambassador Pedro Cuesta, Cuba's permanent representative to the United Nations. The ambassador will then take questions. Given the time constraints, questions have already been received. However, further questions can be submitted in the chat for consideration. The question and answer session will be facilitated by Mr. Bill Martinez of Martinez Arts Consulting and Ms. Marguerite Orberg, founder and executive director of Hot House. And finally, there will be a closing remarks by Mr. Obi Egbuna of the Get Out of Cuba's Way campaign and the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. So let us begin. Again, my name is Gail Walker, and I am the executive director of IFCO, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, and co-chair of the National Network on Cuba. In both capacities, I have worked to support improved relations between the U.S. and Cuba and for an end to the harmful blockade, the harmful sanctions imposed against the Cuban people. Furthermore, as a faith-based organization committed to social justice, IFCO applauds the results of the recent June 23rd UN vote, where the overwhelming majority of the world's nations voted in favor of a resolution to demand the end to the U.S. economic blockade on Cuba, as it has for the past 28 consecutive years. We're deeply saddened that the Biden administration failed to join the rest of the world in voting yes. Yet it is another indication of the US government's isolation in its policy of blockading Cuba. The US government's longstanding sanctions have had a tremendous effect upon Cuba and its people, and this is the case in many sectors, but particularly devastating in the medical area. I was in Cuba a few weeks ago and witnessed firsthand the current medical crisis. Our multiple bags stuffed with medical supplies barely made a dent in terms of the need. It was heartbreaking to speak to a surgeon who had to tell his patients he couldn't perform surgery due to the lack of antibiotics and painkillers. However, it is important to note that Cuba has the ability, the technical know-how to produce the medicines the country requires, but is unable to do so due to the lack of raw materials needed to manufacture many of the basic medicines it needs, including antibiotics and pain relievers. Under US law, any company that uses 10% of US derived materials is not permitted to trade with Cuba. This holds true whether the company is a US company or not. And it's just one example of the extraterritorial nature of the US policy toward Cuba and why it's called a blockade instead of a unilateral embargo. Nonetheless, still, Cuba has managed to produce 5 vaccine candidates to fight COVID-19. Cuba reports that one of the vaccines, Abdala, has a 92.28% efficacy rate, placing it in the top 5 of currently recognized vaccines worldwide. Ironically, while Cuba has managed to produce effective treatments for COVID, the small island nation has a shortage of syringes to help get shots in the arms of the Cuban population. And that's why the Syringes for Cuba campaign, organized by the Global Health Partners here in the US and supported by the National Network on Cuba's Saving Lives campaign, has raised $400,000 to purchase 4 million syringes and is currently working to raise another $100,000 to purchase an additional 2 million syringes. And these are in addition to the syringes sent from others in the international community. If relieved of the crippling US sanctions, Cuba would be able to address its medical needs. In fact, over the past year alone, Cuba has sent 3,700 medical workers, healthcare workers, in 52 international medical brigades to 39 countries overwhelmed by the pandemic. Cuba's international medical brigades have treated patients and saved lives for the past 15 years in 53 countries, confronting natural disasters and serious epidemics, such as the Ebola crisis in West Africa. Cuba has pledged to produce 100 million doses of its COVID-19 vaccine to meet its commitment to share its low-cost vaccines with poorer nations in the developing world. Another example of Cuba's medical internationalism is the medical school scholarships that the Caribbean island offers young people from various nations, including the United States. My organization, IFCO, is proud to facilitate this opportunity for U.S. students. Today, there are nearly 200 U.S. graduates of Cuba's Latin American School of Medicine, with nearly 60% practicing in underserved communities across the country. As Cuba struggles to confront its current medical crisis, her friends in the international community, and particularly those of us in the US, the very country that has maintained the punishing sanctions for more than 6 decades, educators, social workers, labor activists, clergy, and more, those of us who make up the vast Cuba Solidarity Network will continue to stand up and speak out against the unjust blockade and continue to work for normal relations.
My phone is, I'm down in my basement, and my phone is, oops, godly.
We'll continue to do this work for our to normal relations with our southern neighbor. So thank you. I thank you very much. Now we will hear from Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell. the former General Secretary of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA. In addition to being the first ordained woman to lead the NCC, Reverend Campbell has served as a devoted activist for peace and social justice. She has played a critical role in the fight for the return of Elian Gonzalez to Cuba in the year 2000, as well as the return of the Cuban Five. Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I was listening very carefully to what you said, and am so pleased to think that we are still fighting and we are still working as hard as we can to bring to reality the relationship between Cuba and the United States. One of the things that I know from my time in Cuba is that Cuba has many gifts to give us. And it is our problem when we don't go away and don't take time to understand what the gifts they have, their abilities to deal with people who are not well. I know that myself. I became quite very sick at one time when I was there, and it was nothing until a few minutes until I was taken care of and became quite well again. I'll never forget that. But it's not one person. It's what happens in the United States. And I'm very concerned now that we are not bringing to the forth, and I'm thrilled that we're here today, that we can be saying once again, Cuba is here, and we are here to be with them and to walk with this, and to walk with people there so that we can become reconnected in a strength that is failing at some times because of what the United States is unwilling to let people come here to Cuba in the way that they did. I'm very glad for what we're doing here today, and hopefully that when we live, yes, you can tell that I'm getting older. But what I really think is we need to be together in ways like this, and we need to be working with Cuba because this is something that we have been doing for years. And I think there's much yet to be done and things for us to give our lives to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. And I believe it is now your opportunity to introduce our special guest, Ambassador Pedro Cuesta.
Yes, indeed. It is my honor to introduce one that is known to many of you that will come to speak to us in just a few minutes, standing here as a representative of Cuba to the yes, here we come, all so that we can be together, and we will be able to meet with him in just a moment.
His Excellency.
His Excellency, we are looking forward to seeing you and to hearing you speak. Ambassador
Pedro Cuesta.
Yes. Ambassador, we welcome you. Ambassador Pedro.
Thank you very much, Joanne. I really appreciate it, and good morning to all. Thank you, Gail, also for your introductory statement. First of all, allow me to thank you deeply, National Network in Cuba and IFCO Pastor for Peace for organizing this event. Also, thank you very much to all the members of the media for the interest and all other participants in this exchange. As you all know, and has been stressed, last June 23rd, by the 29 occasions, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly in favor of the resolution necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the government of the United States of America against Cuba. Only two countries, the United States and Israel, choose to vote against this resolution. In 6 decades, a lot has been told about this cruel, criminal, and genocidal policy. The voices against the blockade are every day more and more, even inside the US. You are a testimony to that. I would like to thank you all for gathering this morning here with me for this exchange as a representative of a courageous people that continue to fight and stand in front of two viruses, and I would say two killer viruses, the COVID-19 and the blockade imposed by the US. In the last 4 years, the government of the United States added 243 economic coercive measures against Cuba, which remains in effect today. These measures are not mere actions to tighten the embargo, but new methods, some of them unprecedented, that have escalated the economic war against Cuba to extreme levels, with widespread impact in the daily life of our people and in the Cuban economy. Those 243 unilateral coercive measures were intended to restrict travel by US citizens to our country and damage tourist markets in third countries. The Trump administration adopted those measures, which are proper, some of them to times of war, like, like the one adopted with the purpose of depriving Cuba from fuel supplies. They persecuted the health services that Cuba provides in numerous countries abroad. It increasingly harassed our country's commercial and financial transactions in other markets and set out to spread fear among foreign investors and commercial entities through the implementation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. It also hindered the regular and institutional flow of remittances to families. They dealt a harsh blow to self-employed and private workers and hampered the links with Cubans residing in the United States as well as family reunification. All these measures remain in force today and are being fully implemented. Paradoxically, they are shaping up the behavior of the current US administration of President Biden, particularly through the months when Cuba has experienced the highest COVID-19 infection rate, the highest number of fatalities, and much worse economic impact. Just in the past weeks, the US Department of State included Cuba in the unilateral list of trafficking in persons and of countries which are allegedly not cooperating fully with the US efforts in fighting terrorism. All those unilateral and arbitrary listings without any base, authority, or international support are only intended to defame and pressure countries refusing to bend to the will of the US and governments that stand on their own sovereign decisions. Cuba is not a state that sponsors international terrorism. On the contrary, has been a country that has suffered from terrorism promoted, organized, and financed from the US territory. No one can claim that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. Cuba has an impeccable history, an impeccable fight of fighting international terrorism. Cuba disdainfully deplored every maneuver aimed at manipulating such a sensitive issue to achieve gross politically opportunistic goals. Going back to the embargo, for Cuba, the restrictions adopted during the last 4 years magnify the many challenges imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic and multiply its devastating socioeconomic, health-related, and financial impacts. Between April and December 2020, less than a year, just amid the pandemic, the blockade made Cuba to incur in losses estimated in the order of $3,586 billion. Added to the losses of the previous year, the total from April 2019 to December 2020 amounts to more than $9,157 billion. The accumulated damage of the blockade imposed to Cuba during 6 decades of economic embargo amounts to over $147,853 billion. It is important to understand that if Cuba would not have to suffer that policy, and if Cuba would not have been deprived of those resources, the country could go a long way towards bringing much of its infrastructure up to date and could, for example, change the national energy matrix to renewable sources in less than 5 years. That amount, if it was available, could considerable assist in enhancing the living standard of our people and would turn the country's financial situation around, boosting the confidence of foreign investors and creditors, and subsequently increasing the access of the country to financial markets. Under the present conditions, the embargo represents a huge burden for the Cuban population and economy, with particularly devastating effects owing to the COVID-19 pandemic. Cuba has been forced to allocate considerable resources to urgently secure necessary equipment and materials for its national health system. The impact on of the embargo on the health sector, one of the hardest hit during the reporting period, may be seen in the shortages of essential consumer products, as well as the difficulties national industries face in acquiring the necessary supply for inter alia food preservation and drug manufacturing. The negative impact of the extraterritorial component of the blockade could also be seen in the Cuban health sector. For instance, the cases of the German companies Sartorius and Merck stands out, as well as those of Citiva and other regular suppliers of laboratory materials, reagents, and general supplies. Due to the intensification of the blockade, they stopped trading with Cuba in 2020. During this period, Cuba was unable to obtain a total of 32 pieces of equipment and supplies related to the production of vaccine candidates against COVID-19 or needed to carry on the necessary stages for the completion of the clinical trials of these candidates, including equipment for the purification of the components, accessories for the production equipment, filtration tanks and capsules, potassium chloride solution, thimerosal, and reagents. As a result, Cuba had to resort to other providers and intermediaries, which led to price increases of 50 to 65% above normal established prices. Despite all these enormous obstacles and limitations, the work done by Cuba to tackle the pandemic has been recognized internationally. The country has 5 vaccine candidates, I have been mentioned, in development and has sent 57 medical brigades to support the fight against the pandemic in 40 countries and territories. The immoral smear campaign led by the government of the United States against Cuba International Health Cooperation has not been able to curb the intimidation of our professional staff. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cuesta. This was a complete summary for all of us. You may have covered a lot of the topics that we're going to be talking about in this question and answer period. And I know that your time is limited, so we're going to cut straight to the questions. Marguerite and I are going to ask most of the questions that were submitted to us, but in some cases we will paraphrase the questions or combine them since some of the questions overlap from the different sources. We'll start out with the messages from Charlene Mohammed, the host of Liberated Sisters on KPFK Radio, and Nisa Islam Mohammed, who is the editor for the Final Call Press Corps. Their first question is, in his first major address, I should say, the Honorable Minister Luis Farrakhan talked about the end of the blockade, the blockade against the country, so we can access treatments. Can you tell us your thoughts about that and how Americans might be able to get access to the vaccine?
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you very much to Charlene for the question. I think the statement is quite relevant. As I said before, a lot have been said about embargo, and the blockade policy has been gaining. The fight against the blockade has been gaining even more supporters, even included here in the U.S. and particularly also in internationally. We are seeing, for example, the caravans that have been put in place the last Sunday of every month. All of them have been growing each time, bringing more people interested against this fight and in solidarity with the Cuban people. So we are of the view that all these all these fight, all these actions against the blockade, the sending the resolutions that many of you are sponsoring in the different states, and actions to the presidency of the United States, to the White House, letters to congressmen. All that is extremely useful and valuable. And in relation to the question of how people here in the U.S. can have access to the vaccine once they are in place. Cuba has always been open to provide and share whatever achievement the country has been able to make with other countries around the world, and of course, the U.S. is not less. I would like to remember this specific occasion, the offer made by Cuba to the U.S. when Katrina affected this country. Actually, the Henry Reef contingent was specifically formed to help and assist in the fight against the consequences of Katrina, that you all know was not accepted by the government of the time. So Cuba will be open to share with all countries, including with the U.S., its outcome in terms of the development of these vaccine candidates, as in other areas of scientific research.
And so are you seeing the level of movement to end the blockade at it's sort of an open-ended question, but are we optimistic that somehow si se puede, that we shall succeed in ending the blockade? At some point, we've all wanted that, but that's one of Charlene's questions. Are we near the end of the blockade or no?
We are convinced, Bill, sooner than later, the blockade would have to stop. It would have to stop because it's an illegal policy, is an immoral policy, is rejected by the international community, and is also rejected clearly by the most of the population in the United States, including most of the Cuban who live in the United States, who wants to have a normal relationship with their relative in Cuba and have the liberty to freely visit their families in Cuba. This is an untenable policy. It's unsustainable politically, economically, morally, and ethically.
Thank you. And we're going to move to the questions by Elliot Booker, Time for Awakening Media. His first question was, which of the G7 countries that have made requests to trade with Cuba before and after the UN vote? Did you have a lot of the G7 countries already in sync with you doing trade with Cuba?
Well, the only G7 country with whom Cuba doesn't have a normal relationship is actually with the U.S. With the rest of the G7 member countries, Cuba has a normal relationship, including economic relationship, which is also very much damaged because of the extraterritorial impact of the blockade. And as you know, the blockade is not only something that affects directly the bilateral links between Cuba and the U.S., but something that has very profound consequences also for third countries and third countries companies who want to engage in a normal economic, trade, or financial relationship with Cuba.
And where are we with the COVID-19? How many of the various vaccines are in phase 3 of the trials? Where are we at with the various vaccines?
Bill, this is. I would like to first to refer that the fact that Cuba has been able to produce 5 vaccine candidates is very well built on the investment effort that the country has done for years. I would like to remember it was Fidel in 1960 when the creation of the Cuban National Scientific Research Center, who said that the future of Cuba would have to be a future of men and women of sciences, and that in itself and enclose the meaning of what we have been able to achieve not only now but in recent years. I would like to remind, for example, the strike made by Cuba when we developed the anti-meningococcal vaccine, the strides made in developing different cancer vaccines and other pharmaceuticals by the Cuban pharmaceutical industry. So this new development is very closely related, not only to that investment in infrastructure, but also to the investment in human resource development. And since the beginning of the pandemic, we said that we, as a blockaded country, actually, we didn't have any other option that to try to put the best of our science and our scientific resources to try and to go and develop projects to try to come up with our own vaccine candidates to fight the pandemic. And of course, this envisage a lot of efforts, a lot of commitment by the all the scientists, a lot of cooperation. It was not a task of one single institution. It has been the outcome and the result of the very close cooperation among the many scientific institutions in the biotech industry in the country.
And Cuba has reached out to the other South American, Caribbean countries as well. They've been generous in going out to, of course, everyone knows about the brigadistas going out to help so many others around the world. But in particular, for the vaccine, have they reached out to I assume that they've been reaching out as well to the other countries of the Caribbean and South America, correct?
Yeah, we have been clear since the beginning, and as I said before as well. I mean, the results that Cuba will be achieving this will be clearly shared with countries in Latin America as well as other countries in the world. A number of countries I can say that have approached already Cuba, very much interested in the outcomes, and with some of them, we have already signed agreements for when the vaccines are in production phase, and when they have been approved by the Cuban regulatory agency and are in the market, and trials are being conducted also in some other countries like Venezuela, Iran, some Caribbean countries has also approached, and some of the southern nations in Latin America as well have shown as Mexico have shown interest in having access when those vaccines are in the production phase.
Thank you. Elliot had one last question. It was about, years ago, the Congressional Black Caucus signed a memorandum of understanding to try to encourage youth, especially people of color, kids of young youth of color, to get educated there and to become doctors through the wonderful program that Cuba offers to develop young doctors to go back to their communities and serve them. Elliot's question is, it seems like there's not that much force going, or not that much encouragement going on by the Congressional Black Caucus at this time. So, how do we stimulate that? How do we make sure that the unrepresented communities are getting their medical staff trained there, and that if the Congressional Black Caucus isn't following through to push that, how do we push that so that we make sure next generations of doctors are coming our way to serve the communities through Cuba's educational program?
Thank you, Bill. I think this is a very relevant question, and I can say Cuba has kept its commitment to facilitate the scholarships for underrepresented community people, students in the U.S. to have access to health studies in Cuba. And we're also very grateful. I have to acknowledge here the commitment and the permanent fight of IFCO Pastor for Peace in keeping also this program. Actually, as Gail mentioned at the opening, around 200 graduates already have produced this program, and we will be very happy to see more youth from the U.S. coming to take advantage of this, and we're also open to continue working not only with IFCO on this, but also with other initiatives on this. We think that is important. One of the ways I think it can be, made more visible the contribution of this student is to bring more to the public of what they are doing now. For example, they have been inserted in different medical institutions all around the U.S. I think it would be, it would help to make more visible what each of them is doing in all those places where they are, to bring them together and to talk to different communities, to talk to their representative, to in their state assemblies or their representative in Congress and so on. Those are, in my view, very useful ways to raise awareness and on the importance of this program.
Correct. Okay. Wilmer Leon, the author of Politics and Other Perspective, who's also the host of Inside the Issues on Sirius XM satellite radio channel 126. He first has a sort of a general statement. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken and President Biden talk about protecting or enforcing rules-based order instead of protecting and enforcing international law. In light of the recent vote of the UN on the blockade, how hypocritical is it for the U.S. to blockade or sanction countries that are not in violation of international law? That's part one. And part two of the question is, let's talk about the anti-imperialist coalitions that are being formed, whether it's Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, China. How are the anti-imperialist coalitions relating to each other to provide for health and well-being? Those were the two questions of Wilmer and Leon.
Rob, Bill, I mean, you just said it. I mean, this is a very hypercritical policy. It's untenable. Simply, the U.S. government cannot sustain its policy towards Cuba, and we have demonstrated that we are able to sit down together and to fix all our differences. And of course, we know that we cannot solve all of them. We are different, and we have to respect each other, even with our own differences, and respecting each other's respective sovereignty, equality, which is a principle of international law and of the Charter. And of course, not only the case of Cuba, but also so many other people and countries in the UN are realizing this hypocritical approach of the U.S. Government when looking at some relevant international and very sticky issues of international importance. Not only with Cuba, for example, the issue of Venezuela, or the policy in relation to other countries. Of course, and the awareness that what I referred before, all these solidarity coalitions and grouping, the caravans, the love, the bridge, love, building bridge of love initiative are also quite important to counteract this other, hypocritical rhetoric and coming back to the international arena and coming back to multilateralism. It's very clear that if you argue that you're coming back to multilateralism, and you argue that you are committed to principles of multilateral resolve of dispute, the issue of Cuba puts that to the test, and that is very much clear.
Great, thank you. We're going to turn the questioning over to Marguerite right now. Marguerite Horberg from Hot House, take it away.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a very stimulating and educational conversation we're having. And repeating what Bill said earlier, a number of the questions we received sort of cover similar ground around the vaccines and policy and the post June 23rd. So if I don't read the entire question, please feel free to write in the chat that your question wasn't adequately answered. So the first question I'm representing is from the All African People's Revolutionary Party in New Mexico, and it's from Oniesonu Chatoyor, who's a Hood Communist and Weekly Pan-African News, an AAPRP program from New Mexico, and it's another policy question. And the question is asking about the allegations around human trafficking. The question says, recently Anthony Blinken accused the world-respected and renowned Cuban medical team of engaging in human trafficking during the 2021 Trafficking in Persons Report launch ceremony. How do you think this outlandish charge is related to the U.S. recent blockade resolution vote? And what do you think a statement like this signals about the intentions of the Biden administration toward Cuba?
Thank you very much, Margaret, for the question. I think clearly this is a very hypocritical accusation, and as I said before, it shaped very much the conduct and the attitude of the current U.S. administration. Nobody can argue Nobody can seriously argue that Cuba is a country that is engaged in trafficking in persons. Cuba has a very clear commitment to combat trafficking in person, and it's very unfortunate that the current administration decides to endorse in some way the accusation of the President Trump's administration that everybody knows was with the purpose, the intended purpose to cut resources by Cuba. Everybody knows that the health corporation, the international health corporation that Cuba provides to a number of countries is sustained on bilateral arrangement and bilateral agreements signed with all those countries interested in the Cuban corporation. All those professionals involved in that corporation decide freely without any governmental pressure on their participation, and they sign contracts for engaging in this cooperation program. This is an slander and a smear campaign that we have denounced and we will continue to denounce. And it's only, trying and it's very, also in times of pandemic, it's also quite unfortunate that the U.S. engages in this politic of trying to deprive people of health assistance in other countries that otherwise that they cannot have, because the work that Cuban professionals do in those countries cannot be easily supplemented by professionals, national professionals in those countries or any other foreign professional. So this is an unsustainable campaign. Cuba has denounced and will continue to denounce, and we have a proven history, even in of cooperative relationship with the UN mechanisms that work in the area of trafficking in person. The U.S. cannot sustain those accusations against Cuba.
Thank you. There's sort of a second part of that question, which has to do with how Africans in the U.S. and I'm assuming other people of color who are faced with an onslaught of slander and propaganda, how can people join in solidarity to combat this kind of false narrative and be more effective in fighting this propaganda campaign?
Well, I would have to say, for example, many of the countries, and we had more than 50 statements during the General Assembly session that examined the issue of the U.S. blockade on Cuba. And many of those statements at the General Assembly referred specifically to the appreciation and the value that those countries attach to the Cuban Medical Corporation, and many of those stress the value that their people give to the corporation and work by the Cuban medical professional in their countries. Also, during the high-level segment in the General Assembly, a very quite relevant number of the leaders who participated in the settlement in that high-level week settlement also underline the importance and the appreciation of their governments for the solidarity that Cuba has put in place in cooperating in the health sector through the medical brigades with those countries. Many of those countries are from Africa, from the Caribbean, and also I would have to say many of these caravans, because the caravan movement has become started here in the U.S., but now have become more an international movement. And every month in many cities around the world, included in many of the African cities, we have seen caravans of people against the blockade and calling for the lifting of this unjust policy. We very much believe that our African sisters and brothers have also much to say and much to contribute to this international movement against embargo.
Thank you for that reply. I think that if people have links to how to get involved, they could put them in the chat. So the next question, I feel we've covered a little bit already, which has to do again with the vaccines, the distribution. Are there ways people can help with Cuba in the mission? The question was posed by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Sobukwe Shakura and Shavanduka Savanhu. And since we've discussed it kind of at length, I think the question more narrowly focuses on maybe you could speak perhaps about the syringe program, if that's a way people could help.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We very much appreciate all the movement that has been put in place here in the U.S., but also in many other part of the world in trying to mobilize assistance to Cuba with the development of the vaccine program and the syringes program that was already mentioned by Gail in the opening statement. We attach a lot of importance and appreciation to that. And of course, that is one of the areas I said it because of the embargo. We are lacking a lot of spare parts and disposable materials, and syringes are part of those disposable for putting in place the vaccine program, which has been also affected the scaling down of the production precisely because of the lack of some of the inputs needed for the production, not for the vaccine itself, but for the production in an industrial scale, because you need, of course, a number of items, a number of inputs to guarantee, the production scale of the vaccine. And of course, the syringes are very much key to that effort. So I think, and we will continue to appreciate every effort that is done in trying to mobilize here in the U.S. and in other part of the world syringes for Cuba.
I want to just kind of pick up a thread in the chat that sort of also referred to the question, which really tries to emphasize the relationship between Africans in the U.S. and Cuba. So if there's something more specific or pointed about how that particular relationship and solidarity can be strengthened.
Margaret, there is an inextricable link between Cuba and Africa. I mean, and we, in the formation, in the building up of our nation, and the contribution made by Africa to what Cuba is today, to Cuba's independence, to Cuba sovereignty. I, I would not mention, because it would be so many those who contributed to the fight, to the fight for our independence, and to the formation of the Cuban identity. Whatever Africans are, we are seeing each other as sisters and brothers, regardless where they are, if they are in Africa or if they are in the US. And there are a lot of reason for us to continue engaging on issues of interest for both Africans and Cuba. And there is no frontier. I mean, the fact that our brothers are can be here in the US or are there in other countries is not a barrier for us not to engage in on mobilizing awareness on issues that bring us together. And we will be always looking at that, and we will be always open to that networking sort of activities, and engaging with our brothers and sisters of Africa.
Thank you. My last question that I'm reading is from Matt Cedillo from Telewaguar, and it includes participation by Karina Acre Paez, Ernesto Ayala from the Chicano Grassroots Media Group. And the question has to do with how Chicanos can aid the process of global decolonization. And the question says, at the General Assembly of the UN, you stated, more than 60 years after the adoption of the Declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples, the process of global decolonization has not been completed, and the goals set forth in the Declaration are yet to be met. The fourth international decade for the eradication of colonialism, recently declared by the General Assembly at its 75th session, constitutes an impetus to the common aspiration of all member states to completely eradicate colonialism. On behalf of Chicanos living here in the American Southwest, Aztlan as we know it, we wish to thank you for your comments. We would ask your counsel as to how everyday people, working people living inside the belly of the beast, can best connect our efforts to the process of global decolonization.
Very, very, very relevant question. Again, raise your voice, raise your voice, raise your voice to the UN, write to the UN, approach the UN Committee on Decolonization, to which we are a member. And of course, I mean, we have an opportunity. This is the fourth UN decade on decolonization. We have achieved a lot in that area, but the fight is not over. It's far from being over. So all what you can say, all your lobby, all your letters, all your awareness campaigns, all that contribute to the purpose of decolonization. There are still 17 territories which are not being given the opportunity to their people to decide freely on their to exercise their self-determination right. So it's a very relevant concern, and my response to that is just keep the fight on that.
Thank you. I'm turning it back over to William Martinez. Thank you very much.
William, wow, okay. To Bill, okay.
If you allow me, I also would like to recognize and thank the Get Out of Cuba campaign, and also the Zimbabwe Cuba Friendship Association, which has been part of the organization of this event. Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Yeah, big shout out to Obi for putting all of this together. We have two last questions. Actually, we're over time. Ambassador Cuesta has another engagement. So we're going to make this. We have 4 questions from Jeanette Charles, with the producer of Freedom Now, a Pan-Africanist revolutionary radio program on the National Independent Radio Pacifica Network. Jeanette, forgive me for this. I have to pick one of the 4, 5, 6 questions. And I want to narrow it down to this one for now. And maybe you can ask Ambassador Cuesta about this later on. But this question, I think, is sort of summarizes a lot about the roles of the Cuban women, youth, and families in fighting the COVID pandemic, and in particular in the scientific research process, and how the Cuban people are informed and how they're getting their vaccines. What's the role of a family, basically, in Cuba in advancing the COVID education and cures?
Thank you very much, Bill. Again, a very important question, and in trying to summarize my response, we say in Cuba, it's not a vaccine, it's not an institution, it's a country behind that. And we have to understand that is our women, is our youth, is our scientists, is our policy making people, is the intelligence, all the intelligence of the country has been put behind this process. I mean, the youth, it cannot be understood against we had in the fight of the pandemic, particularly in the very earlier stages, without mentioning the role of the youth in going home by home, university students, pre-university students, and engaging as voluntary in tracing the suspects, in tracing the contacts, to make awareness of the people. Women in the Federation of Cuban Women also supporting this program. Our scientists, many of these of the scientists that have been working on the development of these vaccine projects, are very young people, very extremely young people, without a very large service, file, but it's the commitment and understanding the importance of the country in coming up with its own treatment to fight the pandemic. So, in summary, has been the whole effort of a country behind that, and all the living forces of that country, that is men, women, youth, and everybody, and following one cohesive and united direction of the country, and under the direction of the government. And so this has been key, and cannot be explained without understanding that intermix.
Thank you very much. We have one final question, Marguerite. We'll ask this question. Unmute. Hello, Marguerite. Testing. There we go.
Taken by surprise. Hello. The question comes from Zainab Al-Safar from the Al Mayadeen TV, which is a pan-Arab TV channel. And the question says, it's a kind of a long question, but it says the U.S. is overstretched and nearly bankrupt and faces lots of challenges domestically, yet it uses its weapon of unilateral, coercive, maximum pressure and sanctions against various countries as resistance movements, among them Cuba. To what extent do you believe that such sanctions are doomed to fail now more than ever? It's a good note to leave on, I think, because you've already said it's doomed to fail, but maybe there's a little bit more to say.
Margaret, thank you for the question. It's very true. We are living, unfortunately, in a world where we see each time more the emergence of this sort of coercive and punitive actions by countries that have a very key role in the world because of their strategic and economic importance, as the case of the US. But I have to say something. No sanction, no sanction. It doesn't matter how strong it might be, or it doesn't matter for how long time they are put in place, like the case of Cuba, which is the country that have suffered the longest and more comprehensive sanction regime that exists in the world for over 60 years, can't blend the will of the people. Man, the sovereignty and the independence and the resolution of the Cuban people to live in independence and to live in sovereignty cannot be blended with any sanction. That's why I said at the beginning that this is untenable. This cannot be sustained, and we are convinced that sooner than later the embargo would have to be lifted. Also, with your cooperation, with your demands, with your solidarity, to which we attach a lot of importance. I really thank you all very much for all the very relevant and important questions. Thank you to all the media, members of the media participating in this virtual meeting. Thank you deeply to the organizers, to the Zimbabwe Cuba Friendship Association, to the Cuba Get Out of Cuba campaign, to the National Network in Cuba, to IFCO, Pastor for Peace, and the many others I'm sure are behind the organization of this exchange. I thank you all for your presence and for your very relevant question. I'm very much aware there are still many questions out there, but I'm sure that there will be so many other opportunities for us to engage and for me to respond to your questions of today and your questions of tomorrow. Thank you very much deeply for your presence.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cuesta. Obi, I think you have some closing remarks.
Yes. Good afternoon now. On behalf of the Zimbabwe Cuba Friendship Association, on behalf of the Get Out of Cuba Way campaign and movement, we were so honored to thank you, Excellency, for your time, your statements, and we thank the people and the revolution of Cuba for remaining so steadfast. I'd like to also thank Mr. Martinez and Miss Marguerite Horberg for their efforts. And it's always an honor and a privilege to be in the company of Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell and her husband, Reverend Pennybaker. Because as the great poet Sterling Brown once said, struggle is a marathon, never a race. So we were happy to be with them today. In closing, we say that what this event represented is we are going from solidarity to camaraderie. Solidarity was yesterday. Camaraderie is the order of the day, because it is that type of fervor, that type of tenacity that will determine whether the blockade on Cuba is lifted. Right, exactly. We say that our collaboration with IFCO, our collaboration with NNOC, our collaboration with the Saving Lives campaign represents a much needed alliance between the dispersed network that does Cuba solidarity work and the assembled network. So anytime we are able to close ranks, it is of paramount importance, and it is us showing an illustration of taking advantage of the historical moment. We say in the spirit of follow-up, and thank you, Ambassador, for challenging us to follow up, Cuba needs a permanent press corps in the diaspora and on the African continent. In 1959, on Christmas Day, the Hall of Fame heavyweight champion Joe Louis led a delegation of National Newspaper Publisher Association journalists to Cuba. Ebony Magazine was part of that, to sit down with Comandante Fidel Castro to discuss the role of the media in dealing with tourism of that time. And since then, they have been challenges so that they have an alternative press corps. So the fact that we had press from Iran here today, press out of Germany here today, Canada here today, and all over the United States represents the will and the sincere interest to make this a reality. So we are calling for, before the end of this year, as a follow-up to this event, a sit down between press all over the world and Prensa Latina, the national media outlet in Cuba, to make that a reality. In the spirit of journalists like William Worthy, a true freedom rider who as early as 1961 put his life on the line to go to Cuba to challenge US imperialist travel restrictions. To design a state of, and if you share my sentiments, isn't it beautiful to be in the presence of a diplomat who represents a nation that is a classic example of true homeland security? When you represent invading another people's land, conquering another people's land, raping another people's land, plundering another people's land, you can never claim to secure that homeland. You're a thief and an invader, and we are being kind. To the Zionist state of Israel, who decided to follow the United States in this genocidal policy, we have one thing to say to you. Adolf Hitler would have been very proud of you. We say that because in the history books of our former colonizers and captors, when it comes to dealing with fascism, when it comes to dealing with terrorism, when it comes to dealing with colonialism, Adolf Hitler stands alone. But when we look at this track record of the Zionist state of Israel, we say with no apologies that David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin and Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir and Benjamin Netanyahu and Yitzhak Rabin would have given Hitler a run for his money any day.
Amen.
Israel is no stranger to shaming themselves at the United Nations. When they stood up in the United Nations solo and voted against Tunisia's right to self-determination, they had no shame. When they stood up and were the only nation to oppose Algeria's right to self-determination, when they became independent, they had no shame. And when they took it upon themselves to support apartheid in what's called South Africa, apartheid in what's called Zimbabwe, apartheid in what's called Zambia, apartheid in what's called Namibia.
Excuse me, Opie, I think the ambassador is trying to say goodbye.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
I thank you deeply. And I'm sorry for interrupting you, but it's that I have to just leave. I have another engagement. I am overpassed already in time.
No
problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency.
To you. Brothers, thank you, Joan Campbell. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Gail. Very much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Okay.
He's exploiting this.
And picking, okay, so can I finish? So picking up where I left off. So their support of apartheid in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, and Angola, and in Namibia, who were colonized by the Germans, showed that Israel is consistent. Now shifting real quickly to the Biden administration. For those in the US-born African community who have propagated the notion that the last 4.5 years for our people was worse than our first 396, Joe Biden is here to challenge that narrative. Those of you who within his first 90 days, you gave him a passing grade, you were premature at best. because Joe Biden is demonstrating to you by his support of the blockade on Cuba, renewing the sanctions on Zimbabwe, which he is a co-sponsor of, favoring sanctions on Venezuela, planning regime change in Eritrea. He is not interested in the traditional cavalier, deceitful caricature of a Democratic Party white liberal. He prefers to walk in the footsteps of Harry Truman, who's responsible for breathing life into Zionist Israel and the CIA in the first place. He prefers to walk in the footsteps of George Wallace, Ross Barnett, Orville Farbers, and those who were liberal on the outside, but white supremacist on the inside all day, every day. To the United States government, what this vote shows is we as Africans and other oppressed people in the world, we are no longer interested in your lectures and crash courses on democracy. Because evidently you don't know the meaning of the word, or the same people who taught you democracy are the same people who taught Christopher Columbus geography when he came to the United States and thought he was in India. We say that to those, and for those who have worked feverishly and tirelessly to sabotage our genuine efforts to fight to lift the blockade on Cuba, who every chance we get to use a platform to bring it up, whispered that, oh, there's racism in Cuba, and they feel compelled to mention that on our heels all the time. We have a question for them. How did it feel watching a Spanish-speaking African represent Cuba diplomatically with integrity and decency and honor? That's what you saw today. So if you're going to continue to propagate that narrative, we're here to tell you you're fighting a losing battle. You will never be able to divert attention from the genuine efforts to get the blockade lifted. And if you are going to deal with the racism, there's no need to parrot Carlos Moore sentiments, because there's no need to parrot Henry Louis Gates sentiments, because the racism in Cuba is a byproduct of colonialism and the captivity of our ancestors, because no nation has done more in the Americas to eradicate racism than Cuba. But if you want to continue to play Little League nationalism, be our guest, because we work very hard and every now and then we need to be amused just like everyone else. In closing, when we come to deal with the Get Out of Cuba Way campaign, we too have been working. We had 2 concerts within the last year that had artists from 10 African nations, 7 Caribbean nations, 17 US cities, and 5 European Union countries. The first phase of our campaign was to push for the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade to come to the United States. But in addition to that, we are now calling for the creation of a resource pool to support the 4,000 Cuban medical personnel strategically positioned all over the African continent. At a moment in time where non-communicable diseases have become the #1 threat to all humanity, at a time when you look at the 25 poorest nations in the world and 22 of them are in Mother Africa, we say stand up and give our people an alternative to the United States Agency for International Development, give our people an alternative to the Bush Foundation, since he's supposed to be a born-again humanitarian, an alternative to the Clinton Foundation, an alternative to Doctors Without Borders, an alternative to all imperialist entities who masquerade as humane and compassionate people. So we're saying that by the end of this year, we are starting with a few nations. We are going to push for our people in the diaspora to send technical support and material support to the African contingent in Cuba, representing the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade. And we will double down on our efforts to get more people to go to medical school in Cuba. For every George Floyd, a Frantz Fanon. For every Trayvon Martin, a Charles Drew. For every Sandra Bland, a Barbara Justice. Because this represents a continuation of the work of the National Medical Association in 1896. This represents an extension of the work of Booker T. Washington when he established Negro Health Month. This is an extension of the work of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois when he did a sociological study called The Physique and Health of the Negro American. So we are calling for a Pan-African linkage to defend the integrity of Cuba, because we defend Cuba as Africans at home and abroad. So once again, the follow-up to this event will be We are calling for a meeting with Prensa Latina and media all over the world who are interested. And based on the representation, we thank WPFW for recording this live. We thank KPFK, KPFT in Houston, and the whole, the Washington Informer for consistently covering the Get Out of Cuba Way campaign, the Final Call newspaper for consistently covering the Get Out of Cuba Way campaign and movement. So that's our statement for today. We do not want to divert attention away from the incredible presentation that Ambassador Pedro Cuesta gave. And we're going to continue to close ranks with all of you. The recording of this press conference will be made available to press all over the world within the next couple of hours. We thank you all. We exit and depart as we came, in camaraderie, solidarity, and goodwill. Long live the Cuban people. Long live the Cuban Revolution. One unified socialist Cuba, one unified socialist Africa, one unified socialist planet. We thank you.
And we thank you too, Obi, for doing this work. Thank you.
Thanks to all. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you.